Picture this. It's 1871, and if you're standing in the Arizona Territory, you're essentially standing on Mars. Not the romantic Mars of science fiction, mind you, but the real Mars, a place so hostile to human life that every single day of survival feels like a small miracle. The numbers alone should make your head spin. 5,000 American soldiers, TA, that's more troops than Washington had at Valley Forge, are scattered across this vast wasteland, playing the world's deadliest game of hide-and-seek, and they're losing, badly. Every year, Apache raiders are costing the United States government $2 million. In 1871 money, folks. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to $50 million today. $50 million annually, disappearing into the desert like morning mist, carried away by warriors who move through this landscape like they were born from its very stones. Now, imagine you're a cavalry officer stationed out here. You wake up every morning knowing that somewhere in those endless canyons and mesas, Apache war parties are planning their next strike. They might hit a supply train today, maybe a ranch tomorrow, perhaps your own patrol next week. The territory is so vast, the enemy so elusive, that chasing them is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. This is the world that Al Seba limps into when he arrives at Camp Verde in 1871, Apache arrows still festering in his shoulder like infected accusations. But who is Al Seba? Well, that's where this story gets really interesting. Picture a man who seems pulled from 3 different worlds simultaneously. Born in the Black Forest of Germany, and if you've ever walked through those dark, dense woods, you know they produce a particular kind of human being. Tough, observant, patient, the kind of person who notices which way the wind shifts an hour before the storm hits. This German immigrant found his way to America, just in time to get swept up in the Civil War. Now, think about what that means. Here's a man who's already lived through one complete cultural transformation. 7. From German peasant to American immigrant. Then the war takes him and forges him again, this time in the furnaces of places like Gettysburg and Antietam. He learns what it means to track men who don't want to be found, to read landscapes for signs of danger, to survive when survival seems impossible. But here's where Seba's story takes a turn that would be unbelievable if it weren't documented history. After the Civil War, instead of heading home like any sensible person would do, he drifts west into Apache country. And not only does he drift into Apache country, it gets captured. For 2 years. 2 years, folks. Think about that. Most captives in Apache country measured their remaining lifespan in hours, maybe days if they were extraordinarily lucky. But Seba? He doesn't just survive 2 years among the Apache. He absorbs their culture like a human sponge. While other soldiers are trying to understand the Apache by reading government reports written by men who'd never spent a night in the desert, Seba is learning their language from Apache grandmothers as they tell stories around evening fires. While military strategists are studying maps in comfortable offices, Seba is learning tracking secrets from warrior societies who, incredibly, adopt him during his captivity. Let me pause here because this point is crucial. The Apache don't just adopt random captives. This isn't some Disney movie where everyone becomes friends after a musical number. Apache warrior societies are exclusive organizations that guard their secrets more carefully than modern intelligence agencies guard classified information. For them to bring Seba in, to teach him their methods, to share knowledge that had been passed down through generations, that tells you something extraordinary about this man. So when Seba finally makes his way to Camp Verde, he's carrying in his head a library of information that no other white man possesses. He can read a week-old trail that looks like random scratches in the dirt to everyone else. He can identify specific Apache warriors by their gait patterns preserved in stone. Imagine that level of tracking skill. It's like being able to identify individual people by watching their shadows on a wall. And what does Seba do with all this unprecedented knowledge? He walks into Colonel George Crook's office and makes a proposal that sounds absolutely insane. "You want to catch Apache?" Seba essentially says, "Stop sending cavalry to hunt them. Recruit Apache to hunt Apache. Now, put yourself in Colonel Crook's boots for a moment. Here's this scarred, weathered scout telling you to arm the very people you've been fighting, to trust them, to depend on them. It's like a police chief being told the best way to catch bank robbers is to recruit bank robbers. The military establishment reacts exactly how you'd expect. General Howard calls it fighting Satan with demons. Officers who've spent years learning conventional tactics are being told to throw out everything they know about warfare. The very idea challenges not just military doctrine, but fundamental assumptions about civilization, loyalty, and race. But here's the thing about desperate times: they make people consider desperate measures. And by 1871, the situation in Arizona Territory is beyond desperate. Regular patrols return empty-handed so often it's become a dark joke, when they do return at all. Because sometimes, they don't return at all. Meanwhile, pragmatic field officers start doing the math. One Apache scout, they realize, might be worth 20 regular soldiers in terms of desert efficiency. 20 to 1. Those are odds that get attention even from the most hidebound traditionalists. Sieber demonstrates his method by doing something that seems like magic to the watching officers. He reads that week-old trail I mentioned earlier, following sign that's invisible to everyone else, identifying not just how many Apache passed through, but who they were, where they were going, and how long ago they'd been there. It's like watching someone read a book written in a language that doesn't exist. As word of these demonstrations spreads through military channels, something unprecedented begins to happen. The desperate United States Army authorizes what might be history's most audacious experiment in cultural warfare. They're about to discover that sometimes the most impossible ideas turn out to be the most necessary ones. And Sieber's insane proposal is about to transform not just the Apache Wars, but the very nature of frontier conflict itself. But first, he has to convince the Apache themselves to join him. And that, as we'll discover, presents challenges that make convincing the military look like child's play. The transformation begins in 1872, and if you think convincing the United States Army to arm Apache warriors was difficult, try convincing Apache warriors to hunt their own people. But Sieber understands something that escapes most white observers of Apache society. The Apache aren't one monolithic tribe. They're a complex web of bands, clans, and family groups that have been fighting each other for generations. White Mountain Apache have been warring with Chiricahua Apache since before anyone can remember. Ancient grudges run deeper than any recent conflict with white settlers. Sieber's genius lies in recognizing that warfare has economically strangled some Apache communities, while others continue to prosper through raiding. The White Mountain bands, caught between expanding white settlement and aggressive Chiricahua raiders, find themselves in an impossible position. Their traditional hunting grounds are disappearing, their trading relationships disrupted, and their young warriors are dying in conflicts that seem to offer no path to victory. Into this desperate situation, Sieber makes an offer that sounds almost too good to be true. Triple laborer wages, that's 3 times what any Apache could earn doing manual work for white employers, plus protected status for families, meaning wives and children would be safe from military retaliation, even if other Apache bands attacked settlements. Think about what this means to communities where children are literally gnawing mesquite beans for sustenance. Overnight, Sieber is offering to create aristocrats in places where survival itself has become a daily struggle. The first to step forward is a young White Mountain warrior named Apache. His story alone could fill hours of our time. But here's what you need to understand about this man. His father died fighting Chiricahua rivals, not white soldiers, but other Apache. For Apache, joining Sieber isn't betrayal of his people. It's continuation of a war his family has been fighting for decades. Behind Apache comes one-eyed Mickey Free, and this character defies every stereotype you've ever heard about the frontier. Mickey Free is Mexican Apache, a captive who became a cultural bridge, a man who speaks Spanish, English, and 3 Apache dialects fluently. He's living proof that identity in the Southwest is far more complicated than simple categories of white and Indian. Then, there's Dutchie, whose grandfather taught him to track antelope across bare rock. When I say track antelope across bare rock, I mean following animals that leave essentially no physical trace across terrain that looks like concrete. This is the kind of skill that seems supernatural to anyone who hasn't spent a lifetime developing it. These men bring knowledge that transforms not just military tactics, but military understanding of the landscape itself. And Seba's training method? It shocks every traditional officer who witnesses it. Instead of drilling scouts like regular soldiers, Seba moves into Apache wiki-ups. He eats their food, and I mean really eats their food, not just sampling it politely. He participates in sunrise ceremonies, learns the proper way to approach sacred sites, understands which topics can be discussed with whom and when. This is total cultural immersion on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until modern anthropological fieldwork. While other officers maintain rigid separation between themselves and their Indian auxiliaries, Seba essentially becomes Apache in everything but birth. The scouts, in turn, begin teaching soldiers to read what they call the desert's secret language. Every broken twig tells a story about timing. The moisture content reveals exactly when someone passed through. Different Apache bands tie their moccasins in distinctive patterns, so a single footprint can identify not just that Apache passed by, but which specific group they belonged to. Water sources aren't just water sources. They're chosen based on complex seasonal taboos and spiritual considerations that determine which families will use which springs at which times of year. Understanding these patterns means predicting where fleeing Apache will go next, turning the pursuit from guesswork into science. The first joint patrol transforms skeptics into believers overnight. Picture this scene. Scouts leading cavalry through impossible terrain in complete darkness, navigating by star patterns and wind directions that white soldiers can't even perceive, much less interpret. In 12 hours, this mixed force achieves what previous all-cavalry pursuits failed to accomplish in 3 weeks. They strike a raiding party at dawn, catching them completely by surprise in terrain that cavalry should never have been able to reach. The Apache being hunted are so astonished to see soldiers in their sanctuary that some initially think they're hallucinating. But the real demonstration of scout capabilities comes at Turret Peak, and this engagement showcases skills that seem to defy physical laws. Dutchie leads soldiers up sheer cliff faces, using handholds that only Apache hunters know exist, tiny cracks and projections that have been used by generation after generation of warriors pursuing game. The result is a stunning victory that spreads Seba's reputation across both military camps and Apache rancherias. Suddenly, everyone is talking about the German scout who taught soldiers to climb like mountain goats and track like wolves. Yet something profound happens in the evening firelight after these successful operations. The scouts perform ancient ceremonies to apologize to the spirits of those they've hunted. These aren't simple victory celebrations or Christian prayers adapted for convenience. These are complex ritual acknowledgements of the spiritual weight involved in tracking one's own people. The scouts are creating new traditions on the spot, binding Apache spiritual practice with army service through ceremonies that have never existed before. They're acknowledging that this work requires supernatural as well as practical preparation, that hunting other Apache violates natural order in ways that demand spiritual compensation. This ritual innovation tells us something crucial about how the scouts understood their role. They weren't simply mercenaries or traitors, as their critics claimed. They were men trying to maintain their cultural identity while serving a foreign military, creating new forms of Apache tradition to deal with an unprecedented situation. The success of these early operations creates momentum that will soon make Seba's Apache scouts the most feared tracking force in the American West. But it also creates something else, a growing network of intelligence and capability that will eventually challenge the very foundations of Apache resistance. Within 2 years, Seba will command not just individual scouts, but an entire system of cultural warfare that penetrates Apache society at levels no conventional military force could ever reach. And that system will soon face its ultimate test, when it encounters the most legendary Apache leader of them all. But first, we need to understand exactly how this intelligence network operates, and why Apache tracking skills represent a revolution in military science that will echo far beyond the Arizona Territory. By 1882, Seba commands something that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. 200 Apache scouts whose intelligence network has become so sophisticated that they can predict raids before they launch. Let me give you some numbers that should make military historians sit up and take notice. Apache attacks have decreased by 70%. Military casualties have dropped by half. These aren't marginal improvements, this is a complete transformation of frontier warfare. Washington, always impressed by statistics that save money and lives, has become true believers in cultural warfare. But statistics tell only part of the story. The real revolution lies in how these scouts have learned to think like the people they're hunting, while remaining loyal to the people they're serving. It's a psychological balancing act that would challenge a trained therapist, much less warriors who've grown up in a world where loyalty and identity seemed like simple concepts. The Deadliest campaigns unfold as scouts pursue Geronimo through Mexico's Sierra Madre, and here we need to pause and acknowledge what we're really talking about. Geronimo isn't just another Apache war leader. He's become the living symbol of Apache resistance, a man whose very name strikes fear into settlers and soldiers alike. When Seba's scouts track Geronimo through the Sierra Madre, they're reading stories in footprints that reveal information at a granular level that seems almost supernatural. They can tell which warrior carries ammunition by the deeper heel strike caused by extra weight. They can identify where women are slowing the band's pace by the shorter stride patterns mixed among warrior tracks. They can even determine which child rides the gentlest pony by analyzing how carefully certain hoofprints are placed. This is intelligence gathering at a level of sophistication that modern military forces would envy. No electronic surveillance, no satellite imagery, no intercepted communications, MAA, just human beings who've learned to read the Earth itself like a detailed report. Tom Horn joins as Seba's protégé during this period, and Horn represents both the potential and the danger of this kind of cultural immersion. Horn learns to think so completely like an Apache that some whisper he forgets which side he serves. His tracking skills will later make him legendary throughout the West, and ultimately notorious when those same skills are turned to darker purposes after the Apache War's end. But Horn's story reminds us that learning to hunt like Apache means more than acquiring technical skills. It means absorbing a worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between human beings and landscape that fundamentally changes how you see the world. Then comes Sibique Creek, and everything changes. Picture this scene, because it represents one of the most tragic moments in the entire Apache Wars. Scout units receive orders to arrest a medicine man who's been preaching what the military considers sedition, but to the Apache, this medicine man isn't just a political figure, he's a spiritual leader, whose arrest violates sacred principles that transcend any military allegiance. Scout loyalties fracture in real time. Men who've fought side by side for years suddenly find themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that cuts deeper than any political disagreement. This isn't about strategy or tactics. This is about the fundamental question of where ultimate loyalty lies when military orders conflict with spiritual obligations. The battlefield at Sibique Creek echoes with death songs sung in the same language from both sides. Apache killing Apache while soldiers watch in horror, trying to understand a conflict that exposes the impossible position these scouts have been placed in. Scout Sergeant Deadshot, dead, and yes, that's his actual name, weeps as he identifies his brother's moccasin pattern among the hostile dead. Think about that moment. A man trained to read tracks for military intelligence is using those same skills to identify his own brother's corpse. The psychological weight of that moment should be almost unbearable. Meanwhile, Alcacé earns the Medal of Honor by maintaining military discipline when every cultural instinct screams for revenge. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow, awarded to an Apache warrior for choosing military loyalty over blood loyalty when those two forces collided with devastating consequences. Sibique Creek proves that the Scout system, for all its military effectiveness, contains internal contradictions that can't be resolved through training or payment or promises of protection. When sacred and secular obligations conflict, no amount of military discipline can eliminate the spiritual crisis that results. Yet the intelligence network continues to function with deadly efficiency. Scouts decode water source patterns, ammunition cache locations, and family connections that systematically eliminate every sanctuary. They've created a web of information so comprehensive that no Apache band can move without scouts knowing about it. Geronimo himself, the master of Apache guerrilla warfare, admits that no Apache can hide from Apache eyes. This acknowledgement from the most skilled Apache war leader of his generation represents the ultimate validation of Seba's methods. When Geronimo says you can't hide from Apache scouts, he's admitting that conventional Apache resistance has become impossible. The final surrender comes in 1886, but it doesn't come through military might. It comes through scout-interpreter negotiations, Apache voices, convincing Apache ears that continued resistance means extinction for all Apache people, not just the warriors. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex moment in the entire conflict. Scouts who've spent years hunting their own people are now arguing that surrender represents the only path to cultural survival. They're using their credibility as warriors to convince other warriors to stop fighting, but victory tastes like ashes in the scouts' mouths. They've achieved what the United States military couldn't accomplish through conventional means, but they've done so by systematically destroying the very culture they emerged from. Every successful operation has been a step toward the elimination of traditional Apache life. The scouts understand better than anyone that their success represents both salvation and destruction for Apache people. They've preserved some Apache lives by ending Apache resistance, but they've also participated in the destruction of the Apache way of life that gave those lives meaning. When Geronimo finally surrenders, the Apache wars officially end. But for the scouts, a different kind of war is just beginning. Because now they have to figure out how to live in a world where their unique skills are no longer needed, where their dual identity becomes a burden rather than an asset. They've spent years walking between two worlds, and now they're about to discover that both worlds may reject them. The frontier wars end, but for the Apache scouts, peace brings a different kind of suffering. They find themselves trapped between worlds that suddenly have no use for men who've learned to think like both Apache and soldier. On the reservations, they're branded as traitors who sold their people for army wages. In white towns, they're still Indians, regardless of their military service. They carry skills that the government now wishes forgotten but cannot afford to completely lose. These are men who've mastered the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering techniques in American military history, and they've become inconvenient reminders of a war everyone wants to forget. Al Seba continues as Chief of Scouts until 1907, but his story ends in a way that perfectly captures the ambiguity of the entire Scout legacy. A construction accident crushes him beneath a boulder during a road-building project. The official report calls it a workplace mishap, but Apache workers whisper that the boulder moved with supernatural precision. Whether Seba's death was accident, murder, or spiritual justice depends entirely on who's telling the story. To some, he died as a victim of dangerous frontier work. To others, he was finally claimed by forces he'd spent decades manipulating. The Apache workers' whispers suggest that ancient justice finally collected its due, that a man who'd spent his life turning Apache against Apache had met a fate decreed by powers beyond human understanding. But here's what's remarkable about the Scout legacy. Instead of disappearing into history, it transforms and adapts. Scout veterans like Alcacé discover that their unique position between worlds can become a source of power rather than alienation. Alcacé becomes a tribal leader who negotiates between Washington and reservation, using skills learned in military service to navigate the complex bureaucracy that now controls Apache life. His ability to understand both Apache and American perspectives makes him invaluable in an era when cultural translation becomes essential for Apache survival. Other scouts choose different paths. Some fade into desert solitude, teaching grandchildren to track memories across time, passing on skills that seem purely practical but carry deep spiritual significance. They become keepers of knowledge that spans both traditional Apache wisdom and modern American military science. The Scout legacy spreads far beyond Arizona in ways that reveal the true revolutionary nature of Seba's methods. Philippine Scouts study Apache techniques when America faces another guerrilla war in an unfamiliar landscape. Texas Rangers recruit former Apache Scouts, recognizing that frontier law enforcement requires the same cultural intelligence that made the Scout system successful. Military colleges begin analyzing SEBA's cultural immersion tactics as America's first successful counterinsurgency program. The numbers are still impressive. Effectiveness worth $500,000 in conventional forces, achieved for $50,000 in Scout wages. That's a 10-to-1 return on investment that gets attention from military planners dealing with conflicts around the world. During World War II, something extraordinary happens that connects directly to the Scout tradition. Apache code talkers carry their grandfather's legacy of service into global warfare, using their language skills to protect American communications in the Pacific Theater. The same cultural knowledge that once made Apache Scouts invaluable in desert warfare now becomes crucial in modern military communications. Think about that continuity. Grandsons of men who hunted Apache for the Army are now using Apache language to serve the Army against Japanese forces. It's a transformation that reveals how cultural knowledge can be preserved through service even when the original context completely changes. Scout descendants also begin guiding anthropologists to sacred sites, finding ways to encode cultural preservation within cooperation with academic institutions. They're using the same bridging skills their ancestors developed as Scouts, but now the mission is preserving Apache culture rather than hunting Apache warriors. Today, in the same deserts where SEBA first recruited Apache Scouts, their great-great-grandchildren work for Border Patrol. They're using skills passed through 5 generations to track drug smugglers and follow migrant trails, reading stories in disturbed gravel that electronic sensors can't detect. Modern Apache trackers can follow patterns in bent grass that are completely invisible to high-tech surveillance equipment. They're finding people lost in terrain that defeats GPS systems and satellite imagery. The fundamental skills that made 19th-century Apache Scouts legendary remain relevant in 21st-century law enforcement. But perhaps most importantly, modern Apache cultural centers teach tracking as both practical skill and spiritual practice. Young Apache people learn that following footprints means understanding the sacred conversation between Earth and humanity. They're discovering that tracking isn't just about finding someone. It's about understanding your place in the web of relationships that connects all living things. This teaching represents the ultimate transformation of the Scout tradition. What began as military necessity has become cultural preservation. Skills that were once used to hunt Apache are now used to teach Apache children about their connection to the land their ancestors knew so intimately. The irony is profound and perfect. SEBA's insane method of recruiting Apache to hunt Apache ultimately preserved the very culture it once threatened to destroy. By forcing Apache Scouts to maintain their cultural knowledge while serving military purposes, the Scout system accidentally created a bridge that allowed traditional skills to survive into the modern world. Today's Apache trackers, working border patrol or teaching at cultural centers, carry knowledge that might have been lost forever, if not for the Scout tradition. The same spiritual understanding of landscape that made their ancestors nearly impossible to track in warfare now helps their descendants navigate both physical and cultural terrain in contemporary America. The Scout story reminds us that the most successful military innovations often succeed precisely because they transcend purely military thinking. SEBA's cultural immersion tactics worked not because they were good military strategy, but because they were good anthropology. He succeeded by understanding that effective warfare requires understanding the people you're fighting with and against. In the end, the Apache Scouts achieved something unprecedented in American military history. They created a system of cultural warfare so sophisticated that it outlasted the conflict that created it, so adaptive that it continues to evolve more than a century after the last Apache surrender. And in the desert country where it all began, if you know how to look, you can still see the footprints they left behind.